The only morality they recognize is what will further their cause.
By 1980, Ronald Reagan's crusade against communism had spanned 5 decades.
The crusade for freedom is your chance and mine to fight communism.
In 1947, he was the B-movie actor who railed against communist infiltration of Hollywood. 20 years later, as the governor of California, he defended America's war in Vietnam.
But ending the conflict is not so simple as just calling it off and coming home, because the price for that kind of peace could be 1,000 years of darkness for generations yet unborn.
In 1981, communism's old foe assumed a powerful new position. Just like in the movies, America's new president was ready for the final showdown.
We must realize that no arsenal or no weapon in the arsenals of the world is so formidable as the will and moral courage of free men and women. It is a weapon our adversaries in today's world do not have. It is a weapon that we as Americans do have. Let that be understood by those who practice terrorism and prey upon their neighbors.
The Cold War balance of power had shifted dramatically in favor of the Soviet Union during the 1970s. Reagan vowed to change that. He made no secret of his desire to destroy communism.
The West won't contain communism. It'll transcend communism. It won't bother to denounce it. It will dismiss it as some bizarre chapter in human history whose last pages are even now being written.
While critics cautioned against inciting the Russian bear, the Reagan administration made plans to win the Cold War. National Security Directive 75 outlined a strategy to reinvigorate the nation's military defense and encourage political change within the Soviet sphere. Only then, from a position of strength, not weakness, would the U.S. engage in diplomacy. President Reagan's defense proposal was bold and controversial. It called for an investment of $1.5 trillion over 5 years, the greatest military buildup ever in peacetime. New ships, tanks, fighter jets, and nuclear weapons for the American arsenal. And nuclear-tipped Pershing II missiles to strengthen America's NATO allies in Europe.
We must stand by all our democratic allies, and we must not break faith with those who are risking their lives on every continent from Afghanistan to Nicaragua to defy Soviet-supported aggression and secure rights which have been ours from birth. It is the democratic countries that are prosperous and responsive to the needs of their people.
Before the British Parliament, President Reagan made a bold prediction.
What I'm describing now is a plan and a hope for the long term. The march of freedom and democracy, which will leave Marxism, Leninism on the ash heap of history as it has left other tyrannies which stifle the freedom and muzzle the self-expression of the people.
By the end of his first term in office, defense spending reached $34 million per hour. The president said he was arming to disarm. An increasingly vocal minority said he was mad. The nuclear freeze movement argued that the president was leading the world toward nuclear war. 1 million Freeze supporters converged on Central Park in 1982 to denounce the arms buildup.
We want no more nuclear weapons.
Reagan maintained that they had misjudged his intentions. He wanted to end communism, not the world, and he had a plan to do it.
Let me share with you a vision of the future which offers hope. It is that we embark on a program to counter the awesome Soviet missile threat with measures that are defensive.
In March 1983, President Reagan proposed the creation of a space-based missile defense known as the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI. The concept read like science fiction, satellites patrolling the heavens, zapping incoming Soviet missiles with lasers.
What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies?
The Soviet Union was stretched to the breaking point. Fully half of its economic output was needed to keep pace with Reagan's arms buildup. They had neither the money nor the technological know-how to join the race for a space-based missile shield. Just months after the Star Wars announcement, an international crisis dramatized the sinister nature of what Reagan called the evil empire.
My fellow Americans, I'm coming before you tonight about the Korean airline massacre, the attack by the Soviet Union against 269 innocent men, women, and children aboard an unarmed Korean passenger plane.
In August 1983, Soviet air defenses shot down a commercial airliner that had drifted off course.
This was the Soviet Union against the world and the moral precepts which guide human relations among people everywhere.
It was a military blunder. Reagan asserted otherwise.
It was an act of barbarism, born of a society which wantonly disregards individual rights and the value of human life, and seeks constantly to expand and dominate other nations.
As Reagan's rhetoric reached a fever pitch, Andropov became convinced that the United States was preparing for a surprise nuclear attack on the USSR. When Reagan learned this, he was astonished. Do you suppose they really believed that? I don't see how they could believe that, but it's something to think about. President Reagan, it was a sobering glimpse at where the world might be headed.
More than 20 years ago, President Kennedy defined an approach that is as valid today as when he announced it. So let us not be blind to our differences, he said, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved.
Reagan decided he had pushed hard enough. It was time to try a new approach.
People don't make wars. People want to raise their children in a world without fear and without war. If the Soviet government wants peace, then there will be peace. Together, we can strengthen peace, reduce the level of arms, and know in doing so that we have helped fulfill the hopes and dreams of those we represent, and indeed of people everywhere. Let us begin now. Thank you.
President Reagan's about-face, from warmonger to peacemaker, coincided with the death of the third Soviet leader in as many years. Reagan joked, "How can I get anywhere with the Soviets if they keep dying on me?" At 54 years of age, the new communist in charge was in no immediate danger of dying. Mikhail Gorbachev was university educated, reform-minded, with ideas and imagination. He seemed quite unlike the sinister, boorish, senile leaders who had preceded him. Gorbachev was determined to save the failing Soviet economic system and improve the lives of ordinary citizens without abandoning Marxism-Leninism. In November 1986, Gorbachev and Reagan met for the first time at a summit in Geneva, Switzerland. The mood was tense during official discussions. Gorbachev was ready to negotiate an arms reduction on condition that Reagan abandon Star Wars. The president wouldn't budge. But in private, the two leaders forged the beginnings of a personal relationship that would transcend ideology, geopolitical differences, and the Cold War itself. Geneva did not produce any arms limitation agreements, but it provided a historic breakthrough. Just 5 months later, An explosion ripped through reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the Soviet Union. It was an environmental catastrophe, the worst nuclear disaster in history. It exposed a Soviet system that was shot through with corruption and incompetence. Gorbachev vowed immediate and radical change. The Soviet leader introduced glasnost, a move away from government secrecy toward openness, and perestroika, a dramatic economic, political, and social restructuring of the Soviet Union itself. To pay for the reforms, Gorbachev knew he would have to abandon the arms race and seek an end to the Cold War. In December 1987, the seeds planted at Geneva a year earlier bore fruit. Reagan and Gorbachev signed a historic agreement to eliminate intermediate-range missiles in Europe. It was the first step on the road to dramatically reducing nuclear weapons stockpiles. Reagan and Gorbachev found common ground on the issue of nuclear abolition. In 1987, President Reagan traveled to West Germany to seek common ground on human rights. In front of the Berlin Wall, he made his appeal.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
For Ronald Reagan, the one-time Hollywood actor, it may have been his finest performance.
Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate.
Even as President Reagan spoke at the Berlin Wall in 1987, the last great drama of the Cold War was unfolding. For decades, the repression of Eastern Europe had been backed up by the threat of Soviet military force. But in 1988, Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev announced an end to that policy. At the United Nations, he declared, "Force cannot be an instrument of foreign policy. Freedom of choice is a universal principle, and it should know no exceptions." Hardline communists throughout the Eastern Bloc were powerless to stop what came next. The citizens of one country after another rose up against communist domination. Hungary led the way. In June 1989, the Hungarian government held a state funeral to honor and rebury the martyred figurehead of the 1956 uprising, Imre Nagy. 200,000 Hungarians attended. At the same time, Hungary opened its border with Austria, opening a gateway in the Iron Curtain. When news reached East Germany, tens of thousands packed up their belongings and made the 800-kilometer journey to freedom. In Poland, free elections were held, and solidarity prevailed. Lech Walesa was chosen to lead the first non-communist government in post-war Eastern Europe. In Czechoslovakia, hundreds of thousands mobbed the streets, demanding that the government step down. By the end of the year, Alexander Dubček, whose 1968 Prague Spring reforms had been crushed by Soviet tanks, was installed as chairman of the National Assembly. Alongside him was Czechoslovakia's new president, playwright turned dissident turned politician, Václav Havel. In Bulgaria, the Communist Party was renounced and forced to hold free and fair elections.
Free and democratic elections to be held next year.
Only in Romania was the revolution bloody. The most brutal of communist dictators, Nicolae Ceausescu, clung tenaciously to power, only to be deposed, arrested, and then executed on Christmas Day, 1989. Across the country, the Soviet emblem was torn from the Romanian flag in celebration of their newly won independence. In East Germany, the hardlander Erich Honecker was forced to resign. Despite promising democratic reforms, the new government was unable to contain the popular uprising. After nearly 30 years, the Berlin Wall was breached. Within a year, the future of divided Germany was settled once and for all. In 1990, the country was united, and the German people voted to establish a single democratic government. As the Eastern Bloc disintegrated, Mikhail Gorbachev refused to intervene. He was hailed as a hero by those outside his country. At home, he was ridiculed during the country's annual May Day parade. The Soviet Union had lost its international prestige. Perestroika had failed to revive the economy. And the individual republics that comprised the vast Soviet state demanded their independence. Ultimately, the force of change that had swept through Eastern Europe engulfed the Soviet Union as well, and consumed the man who had set them in motion. On Christmas Day, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev, in his final act as head of state, officially dissolved the Soviet Union. The Cold War was over.